Hello, welcome to our webinar on creating sustainable urban communities. And this is part of our Northern Ireland Planner Live programme taking place this week and organised by RTPI Northern Ireland. My name is Roisin Wilmot. I'm the Director for the Royal Town Planning Institute here in Northern Ireland, and I'd like to thank our sponsors Landmark Chambers and Arup for sponsoring this week's events. If you're tweeting today, please use the hashtag NIPlanLive2020. We look to have a good correspondence going on Twitter. Please use the chat function on your screen, and we will come back to these after our two speakers that we have today have presented. So we have two excellent speakers here looking at how we create sustainable urban communities. So our first speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce, is Diarmaid Lawlor, and he is the Associate Director with the Scottish Futures Trust and has a multidisciplinary background and over 20 years experience working across sectors in the UK and Europe, and champions creative approaches to making better places. So an excellent person to kick off this afternoon's webinar. So over to you, Diarmaid.
Thank you very much, Roisin, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Diarmaid, as Roisin says, and I'm just going to present some reflections on sustainable urban communities, mostly focusing on the places we already have. And maybe to kind of start that off by looking at a place in Northern Ireland or in Carrickfergus, and I know there's been a lot of work happening, and I had a really good conversation with Colin McCrossan from the Strategic Investment Board. But I think it's really interesting to look at the place and to look at the way that people are prioritising the future of the place by building collaborative action, collective leadership, and then trying to align priorities. And I guess what's really interesting in that set of things is how do you leverage the historic urban environment, how do you leverage the coastal kind of context, and how do you connect? So it's making the most of things, connecting things up, and then looking at how all of that works. So I guess my first point around sustainable urban communities is making more of the places we already have. And at the heart of that are the needs of people. And this presentation is based on some work I did with the Commission for Prevention and Early Intervention in Edinburgh. And if we truly put people and people's needs at the heart of settlements, existing and future, and then start to understand what is it that people need in their life, in their community, and in the built environment around it. And that particular piece of work suggested that for people to be able to kind of really truly engage with the opportunities around them, regardless of socioeconomic class, regardless of who you are, where you are, what you're from, there's kind of four key dimensions. So the first dimension is a safe base, somewhere I can make decisions from. Could be a park, could be a house, could be a set of relationships. Second is voices heard, so that in this place, in this community, my voice about my needs are heard within the community, within the institutions, and within the place. Third, meaningful relationships, so that the person is able to build peer-to-peer relationships, service relationships, structural relationships, economic relationships, and finally and fundamentally, that there's real choices. So when we think about the kind of outturn of the COVID bit and the onset of the Brexit bit, real choices are absolutely key to the mitigation of some of the things that are about to happen and have happened. But to have real choices, you need meaningful relationships. For meaningful relationships, you need to have a voice. And to be able to use all of that, you need a safe base. Every place needs to be able to deliver on those four things. And our job is to listen to communities and individuals to really understand needs. So the first proposition, make more of what we already have. Second proposition is around understanding needs. And as we understand needs, then I think you can link that to three specific agendas about how we structure services, how we structure the relationships with communities, how we structure the environment itself. So the first is to take a place-specific view of the needs and a place-specific view of the assets and infrastructure that we have. So not to do the best practice from somewhere else, it's start here, start with the people, start here. Secondly, inclusive growth, and that's quite a big policy agenda in Scotland, so that the idea of growth that's fair and distributed, and that the benefits of growth are actually meaningful for local people and that people are involved in it. That comes with choices. It's a choice about putting some stuff here and not there. It comes with choices about regional, it comes with choices around settlement, it comes with choices around community. So what stuff where for the maximum benefit of people in it? And thirdly, around the low carbon agenda, low carbon in terms of lifestyles, transport. I know that Mick is going to talk about some fantastic stuff in Adamstown coming on it, but it's not about any of those things individually. It's about all those things together. And in the nexus of those things, we get the idea of resilience. And I suppose resilience is one of the qualities that has emerged from the way that community response has worked in COVID and other bits. This resilience, this ability to grow, bounce back, change, builds the opportunity to support the needs, as we said, coalesces all these agendas. So there's more opportunities for more people, more often, in more places. And that drives us into some of the structural components of a sustainable urban community, which is around the right services at the right level for the right needs in the right place. And secondly, the infrastructure for that. So one of the final bits, I suppose, are the early proposition, make more of the places we already have, put people's needs at the heart of the agenda, bring together the kind of key policy bits to create resilience, but that the components are about people, services, and the infrastructure. And it's not about one or other, it's about all of those coming together. And increasingly, we're seeing policy agendas like the 15-minute neighbourhood and 20-minute neighbourhood, but those concepts need to bring together services, people, infrastructure. If we bring that in and just look at how does all that work now? What's different now? What's different today from what was happening a year or two ago? And how does the COVID kind of bit work? And so this diagram is kind of showing three different dimensions. We're still in this thing and we're still trying to learn it. But I guess the success factor in settlements and in places and in urban and sustainable settlements seems to have been around a galvanizing common purpose, seems to have been around something of people stepping up and saying, I'll do that, I'll fix that, we can sort it out. Seem to have been something about a very clear focus on impact. Is it going to make a difference? Is it going to help that family? Is it going to do something? And very, very focused on community. And around that then, you can see that new and different things have kind of emerged around key worker status, new words like shielding, the way that the money has kind of gone to communities. So there's something around the sustainability which we need to use learning. So I guess the learning is going to be situated in the different places, but it's really important, I think, that we capture the learning. Second bit is we're also now moving into the kind of recovery phase, and the transition from the emergency bit into the recovery bit is going to set a path for future action, set a path for future investment, set a path for future change. And inside that, then there's kind of some current priorities that we might start to think about buying land if we can, reallocating spaces, improving maintenance and repair so we reduce down some of the burden, and looking at structural bits like community wealth and anchor institutions. We've stress tested communities, we've stress tested institutions, used the learning to create the infrastructure, the service and collaborative infrastructure for the future. And the outcomes of that then are more resilience, addressing the vulnerabilities more comprehensively, building in the safety nets, and making sure there's inclusion. All of this stuff is about sustainable urban communities. All of this stuff is about the nexus of services, people, infrastructure. And as we start to look at that, whether it is in Carrickfergus or whether it is in Bangor or whether it is in Belfast itself or other cities, it provides the anchor for future different. And we're going to be moving into a future different. So it allows us to start layering in new infrastructure that might come from the Green Deals, rethinking some of the infrastructure under the City Deal infrastructure, reimagining how the way that care kind of lands and how that spatial context hosts all of these different things could give you different outcomes by relocalizing things, connecting things up, and maximizing investment. We've recently completed a little bit of work which looked at the role of community data in settlements and in communities. What data did people use to make a difference in the COVID bit? And in Edinburgh, we had a huge issue around food and the new vulnerables, so people that were on part-time work and contract work all of a sudden had no money coming into the house and discovered really quickly that they were in a really difficult position, and then we're kind of moving into the new poor. So we had new vulnerability and existing vulnerability, and communities responded. And I suppose what was interesting is that they didn't respond with really complex sets of data. They responded because they knew people. Women knew that the family needed food. Communities knew that that group of individuals needed help. How did they know? And I suppose that how did they know and what did they do directly links back to some of the pattern and process of what a sustainable urban community is. And I guess about 5 kind of dimensions of that data seemed really important. First of all, who knew what was available? So if you don't know what's available, you can't act. So one of the key bits in a sustainable urban community is to make sure there is total clarity on the availability of assets. Secondly, is that there's a way of communicating things. So if it's available and if things are happening, how do all the people in that area get to know that as quick as possible? Thirdly, how do I get to it? How do I get to it? I walk to it. How do I get to it? Drive to it, park up, whatever it might be. But part of that accessibility is about the digital accessibility. It's not enough just having a broadband coming into the house. If you can't use the website and you can't access the stuff, it's not enough. And that kind of lends itself to a land use issue, but also to a service issue around digital as a service in local communities for older people, younger people, and for the confused, including myself. Fourthly, around capacity, the COVID bit has stress tested the capacity of institutions, businesses, and communities. And that then is starting to kind of build the opportunity for real co-production, real partnerships, and a new and different way of delivering things. And that capacity is crucial to how we move forward, but the capacity needs spaces, and the spaces need connection, and the connection need coherence, and that then gives you your social capital piece. What's also interesting around that, again, around the concept of the sustainable urban community is the data bits are about word of mouth. Some of it's written down, some of it's not, some of it's formal, some of it's not. But the needs that came out of the COVID bit in a stressed situation, the key spatial needs are about emergency food, hot food, getting prescriptions to people, space to look after people, give people a hug, say you're all right, deal with the isolation and address the mental health bit. So now we have data on some of the emergency provisions that need spaces in every community, whether it's a village, town, district, whatever it might be. And that the people who provide those responses are not necessarily just the government or the businesses, it's a whole plethora of people. And that then starts to build us into what are the necessary infrastructures and spaces that are needed for day-to-day sustainable urban communities, but also in a lockdown or a stressed out or a kind of crisis bit, what are they? And there's kitchen bits, agenda-free spaces, spaces to look after people, digital space. So there's a kind of a suite. So I know we can describe a suite of spaces and components and relationships that a sustainable urban community needs. We can then start to kind of visualize and scenario plan how we would reconfigure the settlements we already have, like Carrickfergus, or new settlements like Adamstown, and starting to look at it. Whereas some of the models we've had have been hub and spoke, so everything you need is in the middle of somewhere, unless you're not able to get there. The COVID bit then had kind of set up a decentralized model where there were pop-up hubs here in Scotland and I know in Northern Ireland as well. So at community level, different services happening in different areas. Although they were set up as temporary interventions, that then starts to provide a new different spatial context for the future around which we can start connecting up infrastructure like active travel. If you then bring that down to what that might look at, the other bit that kind of came out of it is the crucial importance of public space, but also the crucial importance of, if we are starting to look at kind of local hubs in a way that Adamstown does really, really well, it's to start looking at local economic strategies around that. So where are the shops around that? Where are the facilities around that? Where's the meaning? Where's the local economic meaning? Where's the local community meaning? How does it all connect? And how does that then provide an anchor for future investment in low carbon infrastructure? The final bit around some of the spaces, it could be that these are in existing libraries or in existing schools, or it could be new stuff, empty shops, but there seems to be a need for kitchens, seems to be a need for agenda-free spaces, and there seems to be a need for some of these digital spaces. And if you then stress test that and say, you know, the sustainable urban community needs to work for mommy, daddy, young fella, young one, day to day, but it also really needs to work for all those people and everyone else around it when there's a shock. And so I guess that the sustainable urban community thing needs to have an operating framework around ordinary and extraordinary. And in the extraordinary thing, this one kind of looked at, if you have a distributed model, it means that most people in most places have most stuff that they need in some form, and that there's predictability around it. And it means that even if you lock down some of the spaces, some key bits of public infrastructure are available, and those key bits of public infrastructure provide key bits of emergency services. So we can then start to plan up from the house to the community, to the hospital, to to the city centre, all the different emergency bits that move forward and how they're all planned, so that the sustainable urban community isn't just the locality, it's the system of systems. It's the system of communities that kind of come together. Finally, how do you do it? Well, I think that in Northern Ireland you're already doing lots and lots of stuff, and I know the Ministerial Advisory Group and the Strategic Investment Board and the RTPI and the Infrastructure Advisory Body are all talking about the idea of place, are all talking about the idea of kind of the importance of local. So I think one really important thing is to coordinate that and plunder things. You know, there's stuff that Scotland has done, there's stuff that's happening down in Dublin. Just take it, pull it together, don't duplicate, but just kind of accelerate the good work. Secondly, it's to look at the right tools for sustainable urban communities to grow. So a master plan might be suitable for some things sometimes, but often we need a framework for evolution, because the town is full of different moving parts with different people at different scales. So we need a narrative, and a narrative that kind of says what kind of place is it we're trying to create, why does it need to change, and what should those futures be. They're deceptively simple questions, but if you use those simple questions with collective leadership, purpose, and a focus on the outcome, and hold people accountable to the answers, it constructs a simple story, a simple diagram that says that's the future we're after. Inside of it, a master plan can help us do bits and pieces. Final bit, then to deliver that into action, there's three key bits in the program. So there's obviously all the kind of timing of it and the different participants and the way that planning and all sorts of other things work. What the three things are: one, collective leadership, reflecting on COVID, embedding some of the learning we have from the best practice from RTPI and making everybody is kind of bringing it together and building collective leadership up front. Second is that within the settlements there needs to be anchor collaborations which could move across community sectors, third sectors, public sector, private sector, but a bunch of people are doing things in the area which can grow. So the anchor is not just a building, it's not an individual institution, it's a collaboration. And finally, that the way that the sustainable urban community works is delivering on place, is delivering on inclusive growth, is delivering on low carbon, so that the people in that community have the best chance of the most access to the most meaningful resources to do the most things to sustain them. So just to kind of finish off and to go back, I started off with the kind of image of Carrie Fergus on purpose, because I think it's important that we understand that what a sustainable urban community looks like is the ordinary built fabric around us that functions better for the benefit of more people more often, and the future sustainable urban communities that might look different need to have equivalent performance based on those ideas of people, service, infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diarmaid. That was excellent and a really good start for our afternoon now. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. But before I do, please remember to put in your questions in the chat box, and we'll come back to them after our next speaker has spoken. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mick Mulhern, who's the Director of Planning and Transport at South Dublin Council. So you're very welcome. And Mick was previously with the Mayor of London for some time as well. So thank you very much, Mick.
Great. Roisin, thanks a million. And thanks very much to the RTPI for asking me to come along and present on the work that we've been doing in Adamstown. I'm really happy to do it and kind of promote some of that good work. And also thanks Diarmaid. I think it's quite interesting piece, and it's encouraging to know that people are actually being able to spend the time to think about how we respond to COVID over time and what that might mean for the future of planning. With some interesting insights about how we capture and access data and kind of how we might allow places to change over time. So thanks for that. I'm going to talk about my views on what it takes to create sustainable communities, and I've been asked to talk specifically about Adamstown, which is a regen area in South Dublin, and so I'm going to focus on that. I'm just going to click on to the next slide here. So there's a couple of things that I'll focus on really. The first is, what do we need to do to prepare for change? I'll talk about how we've progressed at Adamstown, some of the components that I think are important for successful placemaking. And I know sustainable communities, I mean, to me, placemaking, sustainable communities, it's all one and the same goal, really. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some of the stuff that Diarmaid was actually talking about, which is, you know, the importance of being and continuing to be flexible. So I've been asked to talk about Adamstown, but I've included this as a slide because I think it's just an interesting comparison to boil down what do we need to do to prepare for change, for large-scale regen to take place and to create sustainable communities. So I've just included the 4 big regen areas that we've got in South Dublin. There are others, but these are our 4 largest. We've got Adamstown, which is Clonburris, Tala, Naas Road. And not that housing numbers are a measure of scale or importance, but I think I just included those there to kind of give people a sense of the scale of some of these places. So they're quite large. They're effectively creating new towns within South Dublin. And for me, I think in preparing for change, I think there are 4 key elements. I think there's that you need to have and you need to have thought about and you need to have addressed before actually things start to happen on the ground. And firstly, you need a plan. I know that sounds really simple, but you need a plan. The plan needs to have a really clear vision that is bought into technically in terms of your architects and your planners or your engineers, politically in terms of your, you know, your councillors or your statespeople or whoever that might be, but that there is political support for what you're trying to achieve. And then from the community that there is some, look, you'll never get everybody on board, but that there's some recognition that this plan is credible, it's robust, and also the development sector and landowners kind of want to see that happen. So I think progressing and preparing a plan that's credible and robust is paramount. I think land is essential. Either you have willing landowners who want to do stuff or that you own the land yourself and want to do something with it. I think all the will in the world of having a good plan but not the land becomes a real complex and challenge. I think funding and money is really important. Be that, again, a willing landowner who wants to develop, be that a council or a local authority who wants to develop and has the funding to do so, or be that access to state funding to build some of those complex pieces of infrastructure that are generally needed on some of these big regen sites. And finally, you need the skills, again, whether that's internally within your own team or a consultancy that you bring on or a landowner who has the right aptitude and the right desire to create those places. So I've just kind of noted out some of our big regen areas where we are on some of these. And I know Diarmaid, I was talking to him earlier, I know Diarmaid himself has worked on Clonburris, and it's interesting, we're a long way down the line, but we still haven't cracked. We've cracked the plan, the land, the skills, but we don't have the money yet. But we're in discussions with government on that. In Tala, we have a plan, but not the others. And in the Naas Road, we have the skills, and that we've just brought on a multidisciplinary master plan team to support us in doing that. So we don't have the plan yet, but their intention is to help us put in place a plan that will allow us to access money and get the landowners on board. But I thought it was helpful just to set that out. So Adamstown in particular, it's the area in yellow on the map. It is edge of city development. It was built as it was identified on the edge of Lucan, which was a settlement that was built, almost as a village, probably 100 years ago. And this is an extension to that well-established village. It's on the Kildare to Dublin rail line. It's on the N4, which is one of the main routes out of Dublin into the Midlands, and it's about 233 hectares inside. But just to note here, it is and was greenfield expansion in effect. Adamstown, it's what's called a strategic development zone, and that concept was introduced in Ireland in 2000 through the Planning and Development Act. And in essence, what that is it's a very prescriptive plan that puts responsibility on the local authority to produce the plan, and then it gets adopted, and ultimately it almost gives landowners a kind of an approval in principle. But we decided as a council to progress with designating Adamstown as an SDZ in 2001. We prepared a plan in 2003. First homes were then built and occupied in 2006. We then had the crash 2008, which effectively in Ireland was quite negative, and most people will know that. And kind of saw nothing happen in Adamstown for about 5 or 6 years. And off the back of that, as the developers and some of the land changed hands and came in and out of NAMA, there was a more credible package of landowners around. So we sat down with them and agreed revisions to those plans in 2014, and then a further set of amendments in 2020 to the plan. This, in its really simplest form, was the plan, the 2014 plan for that 223 hectares of land, and what we, the concept has stayed the same since 2003. I know we call it a 15-minute city now, but in effect that's what we were and have been trying to create in Adamstown, which is space for about 9,000 homes, a population of nearly 20,000 people, with a range of new parks, public squares, amenity spaces, community facilities, services, well-defined streets, well overlooked, access to district centres and local centres, access to public transport, access to community spaces, enterprise centres, schools, education, creche facilities, all of those things in there from the outset. And I suppose one of the things about an SDZ is, as I've already said, is it is quite a prescriptive tool. It puts a huge amount of emphasis on the local authority at the outset to produce an EIA and an SEA and a transport assessment and housing modelling and a viability appraisal and all of that stuff, which ultimately then gives everybody a huge amount of certainty that what's on the table has addressed all of those kind of planning requirements from the outset. And then it gives that the landowner and the developer, be that a local authority or a private landowner, real certainty about what is required. Now, you can vary it, but if you don't, in essence, if you're not varying this, your planning applications, you can come in from scratch and get a planning permission in 8 weeks. And there's a much streamlined kind of planning conditions compliance approach afterwards. And it's all very, very clear about what happens. So from the moment you start a planning as a developer, you can be out on site, 3 or 4 months later, potentially, on the complexity of the site. That is very, very useful and very good and very clear. With that, though, it brings restrictions in that there is and always will be issues around, well, we didn't foresee something, there's an issue with something in the ground, now that we realise, some of the detailing a bit better, sometimes that level of prescription can actually be a hindrance and can be a bit damaging in some ways on particular aspects where maybe you're not fully up to speed on stuff. But like I said, it is that principle of the 15-minute city which we've stuck to very, very closely over the last kind of 15 years or so. So how have we been doing in Adamstown? There was that period of I'll be very honest, about 5 or 6 years where there was limited progress. But what we're at now is we are building 2 parks, one at Tandy's and one at Airlie's. Planning permission secured for another 2 parks. We've built pretty much the majority of the road network. The train station is open. We're in the final stages of planning for our district centre and local centres. We've built a number of the schools and the community centres. There's still a lot more community and amenity space to get delivered and public transport upgrades needed in terms of the infrastructure, but we are progressing along. We have a phasing plan with the SDZ. There's 10 phases that you work through, and we're up to about phase 4 or 5 in terms of the infrastructure delivery. In terms of housing delivery, the area has potential for nearly 9,000 homes. We have, as a council, we've permitted 4,000, of which 400 are social and 800 are affordable. We have 3,000 homes are now occupied with about 6,000 or 7,000 people living there, nearly 7,000 people living there. 500 are currently under construction, and there's a further 1,000 in the planning system. So between the 4,000 that are permitted and the 1,000 more, we've got about 3/4 or 2/3 of housing having worked its way through the planning system to date, which, from our start in 2003, I would fully accept that's slow, but there's pretty extenuating circumstances around that. So one thing that when you look at, kind of more up-to-date thinking around what does it take to create successful places, I think none of these concepts on the left would be unusual. The principle of compact growth or 15-minute cities, connectivity, getting the right housing mix, making sure that there's the proper access to jobs and services, that the community facilities are there with amenity space and access to health and well-being, and that developments are climate resilient. So if we imagine those kind of 6 key themes as, look, what are the big components? On reflection, how has Adamstown compared against a number of those? And I think, this is just a very quick analysis. I think we've done well on some of those. Say on the principle of compact growth, I think, the very clear principles around good urban design and 15-minute neighbourhoods. But I think, you know, the density that we're at 55 to 65 units per hectare, I think that to this day would be, you know, questionable about as to whether or not that's the right density. Could it be higher? You know, the site was designated in 2003. It was a greenfield expansion. Would we do that now? Possibly not. And we're not doing that now. We're now looking at brownfield land instead. On connectivity, you know, we secured a new train station with 3 trains an hour. That was supposed to go up to 7 trains in 2000. That's been delayed by 5 or 6 years. We have a great street network, well overlooked. The QB quality bus corridors are in, but the bus services, again, have been slow to materialise. Perhaps our car parking space ratios of up to 2 spaces per home in some instances is probably too lax against today's standards. And, you know, on issues around smart and capturing data, you know, we've been poor on that. Our housing mix, again, it's been slightly focused on houses and duplex, 70%, 30% apartments. And you know, how we've been trying to secure affordable and social housing, I think, from 10 years ago, I think we'd be looking to secure a lot more affordable and social now. Jobs and services, again, you know, we had a pretty rudimentary idea about kind of enterprise centres, which I think as a council we're now much more sophisticated in thinking about how we attract small-scale businesses into the area. But again, the planning scheme is nowadays it's a little bit outdated and a bit prescriptive in terms of the footprint, etc., that's expected, and that's led to some problems. I think on kind of community amenity, health, well-being, I think we've been really, really good on that. But on climate resilient, I think we tackled a number of the issues around, say, water and sustainable urban drainage and retention of biodiversity, etc., really well. But I think increasingly issues around climate and, you know, for example, energy and carbon planning, you know, wasn't really a concept when we were back in 2003, 2004. And equally, I think, you know, as another example, cycling, you know, the streets that we've designed are good, but, you know, they don't, you know, it's not cycling first. It's more of a balanced approach, which I think, again, if we were back at the outset now, we'd be probably taking a different approach. And I think that's probably one of the questions about an SDZ, about how flexible some of that stuff allows us to be over time. So kind of to sum up, I always like this image. It's the plan, it's Wren's plan for London, which he developed immediately after the Great Fire in 1666. And I think, you know, as a planner, I think you could take a lot of kind of immediate comfort from that, and it makes a lot of sense. And you know, I think very rigid and formatted on. I think you can recognise St. Paul's Cathedral on that. And what's interesting is what was actually built is completely different to what Wren's plan was originally. And I think you can kind of, that can go 2 ways. You can either be completely disheartened or you can take some comfort from that. And I think the reality is, in a place like Adamstown or in a place where we're all doing planning work, you have to recognize that a plan is a plan, and it's a moment in time, and actually reality takes over. And I think so long as people are approaching decisions and change with the right frame of mind and with the interest of creating really quality built environments and understanding why maybe a plan is incredible and it actually needs to be something else, and not just accepting that, but challenging it and making sure that it's still focused on securing a really excellent built environment. I think that's okay, and I think that's fine for plans to change. And, you know, look at London. London's a fantastic city, and you almost have to wonder if Wren's plan for London was built out, would it be, you know, it's almost Haussmann-esque for akin to Paris. But I think it's, you know, it's good to be flexible, and I think, you know, some of the things I've mentioned already about, you know, how much foresight did we have around issues around climate change, the importance of cycling, some of the stuff Diarmaid was talking about already about COVID and how we might build that in. And I think a really big one for us on flexibility and the need to prepare for changes. We now have 7,000 people living in Adamstown, which when the plan was written, there was nobody there. But yet the plan is rigid and doesn't allow us to respond to some of the challenges and issues that residents are raising with us, which, you know, I think on an SDZ Mark II, I think we'd be keen to kind of address. But I think that kind of sums me up, Roisin, and I'll hand back to you at that point.
Lovely. Oh. Thank you very much, Mick. And if we can welcome Diarmaid back as well, we can have some questions. Thank you both. They were really interesting and valuable presentations for this afternoon. We've got a few questions coming in. The first one is about perhaps difficult landowners, and how can you coerce them? Is that the right word? Coerce landowners to collaborate and help create these urban communities. So if it's not in public land ownership, how do you get them to be involved and buy into the vision?
Yeah, it's a good look. That's the hardest part, isn't it? That is the hardest part. I think it is about a process. So for example, at Adamstown, there's 4 key landowners. The public don't own any land there. Sorry, there's some quite bad feedback. I'm not sure if that's on my end. It's kind of making it quite hard to hear. Is there? Okay, I think that's solved it. Whoever's done that, thanks, Adam. Perhaps. So I think in Adamstown there is no landowners. Or sorry, the state doesn't own any land. It's 4 private landowners, and equally in Clonburris, one of our other big regen areas, is 4 landowners. Now, as a council, we own 33% of the land there, and I think for us and what we've done well in those locations is the process of preparing the plan needs to involve the landowners, and it needs to recognise some of the challenges that they themselves face as landowners in trying to bring forward land. That's worked well in places like Adamstown and Clonburris, where the landowners are developers and want to bring forward something. And actually in both of those locations are quite reputable developers. In our 2 other big regen areas, one is Tala. That's a brownfield. And I think once you move into the area of brownfield land, it becomes much, much more complex, because you have in Tala and in Nace Road, you've got a myriad of varying sizes of landowners. And I think bringing them together is difficult. I think it is about a process of bringing landowners around a table, hearing what they have to say, trying to put forward a plan that's credible and robust. And at the same time, picking those bits about early delivery. In Nace Road, what we're trying to do is to focus on our first phase of development and locating that in places where there are willing landowners prepared to, put money on the table, to engage in a process and to try and bring forward their land. And at the same time, we're bringing state investment along with that. But I think brownfield, I think if people can crack brownfield regen with multiple landowners, like that's the hardest part of brownfield regen, without a doubt. So that's a bit of a sprawling answer, but.
No, that's great. Thank you. Diarmaid, have you got any reflection on how you bring in different landowners and draw them together?
Yeah, for me, I think Adamstown and Clonburris are really interesting, because the strategic intention is to create a particular kind of place, and that's expressed in policy. So I think the first bit is around a strategic intention that is captured, so it's unambiguous, and it's not about whether the landowner thinks he might like to do this or might like to do that. In this geography, for these reasons, we, the collective, are going to seek these outcomes. So I think that's really important, that there's strategic intention, and that strategic intention has backing. So I'd say that's the first bit. I think the second bit is within any locale, there will be some landowners, or there will be some partners where it's the opportunity of collaboration by default is there to say, okay, let's start talking with the first movers who might move. So I think that the point on that one is to invest energy on first movers first, rather than killing yourself on the people who are just not going to do it. So strategic intention, first movers. And then I think there's a suite of actual interventions that aren't available to everybody in every place, but there's a kind of suite interventions. So one is, and we're just talking with Mick just there now a while ago, around direct provision of infrastructure. So if the public sector is funding through the city deal, the region deal, or future deals infrastructure, then there's a legitimate case for conditionality to say, you're welcome to develop this land, you're welcome to pile up the houses, but you're tapping into our streets, and here's the rules of engagement. So I think direct provision of infrastructure shifts the game. There's also the potential, and in some of the brownfield and regen bits, where there's fiscal or financial incentives to trigger certain performance. And then that kind of brings you down into the kind of regulatory bit. And for me, I would say coercion it's a tough game. If your starting point is coercion, it's a tough game. So I think there's a spectrum, strategic intentions, then into your kind of first mover investment, and then into a portfolio of interventions.
Thank you, Diarmaid. We've got an interesting question here, and I think it's for Diarmaid to do a critique of Adamstown. So pitch you against each other, and whether you think that the Adamstown has provided an inclusive approach to catering for the different range of accessibility needs of society.
Yeah, I think Mick's analysis was really honest and really helpful. And I think if you look at Wren's plan and what happened in London, over time, and say that's almost certainly an inevitable trajectory for Adamstown. There will be variations, things will kind of change in it. So what I'd say on the plan is it was created at a point in time, and it did the best it could with the known knowns at that point in time. And a radical set of interventions at that time was the Finance Act, which triggered the strategic intention to create a very particular kind of settlements, which prioritised active travel and streets. And that actually pushed the architectural community in Dublin and in Ireland to kind of go, you need to create streets, not roads and stuff. So step up to that. So I think the first bit is the spatial structure implicitly tries to create a connected infrastructure to meet most needs most times for most folks. So I think that's its strategic intention. I think the district and the kind of local bit is where the timiousness is interesting, around district centres and in bigger centres. I'm not sure that at the time that they were constructed, we were really clear, what is a district centre and how would it work and how does it flex across time. And I think that stuff like the COVID bit is starting to question typologies. I would argue that it's starting to make us question density for sure, as Mick was talking about co-locations and working from home and different ways of accessing services. The final bit I'd say, and I think Mick is right as well, once the space starts to get occupied by communities, that community starts to construct a mandate of how it wants to see itself expressed, and will bring with it a plethora of different needs. So I think that's where the plan will flex around two areas. I think the first one is around how the services in that area start to change around the actual needs of the actual population. And then I think that the second one is either by objection or by declaration to say this is the new and different type. So to go back to it, I think it's a great plan around its intentions in time. And I think that the opportunity of flex is there. I think that it's probably the best spatial framework that the Edge of City in Dublin did to create the opportunity of most accessibility for all.
Thank you, Diarmaid. So Mick, you got a good report there, so that's great. Wondered, in Adamstown, did the council use any precedent developments to help form the design? Was there anything that came up?
Saw that one. I wasn't actually involved back in 2003 when the plan was done. I think we're now actually dealing with one of the local centres, and part of the district centre is in planning at the moment, and I think. If you look at them, I think they're a bit theoretical. Like the plan itself around those is a bit theoretical, and I think spaces that work really, really well, like a normal high street in any part of the UK or Northern Ireland or wherever. I think this plan probably doesn't really deliver on a lot of those. It kind of accepts the big Aldi or Lidl box being dropped into a space and recognizing that as a key thing, and says, well, they are what they are, and I think it's probably a bit limited on those. So I think probably one aspect that could have been different would be a better understanding about how high streets work, which I think there's much greater understanding about that these days than maybe there was back 15, 20 years ago at the inception of this plan. So I'm not sure what precedents were used, but I think it's safe to say it wasn't the kind of the high street model that's kind of really strongly emerged in the UK, and the support and the recognition of how important that is as a social and community place, and the physical makeup of that. I'd say probably that would be the model if we were starting again. I think that would be the model that we'd be absolutely promoting.
I think just I was involved a little bit in the Adamstown and also in Clonburris, and I think that the district centre is a really interesting question, because if the plan is primarily a residential-led plan, And I found this sometimes in the past where a master plan is primarily residential. The focus is on getting the streets to work, getting the houses to work, and the district centre are the kind of the bits at the end. I think if you flip it and start from the district centre as the heart, and start to kind of scenario around that, and start to think about what would community uses in that look like across a series of different times. What would public services and public service blends look like across time? So it's not just the health centre way off in the field or whatnot. So it's a constituent of the street. And what do different business models of different business types look like? So I absolutely agree. I think it was land tenant, land and anchor kind of user. Actually, we needed a lot more flex. And I think that 2008 and the subsequent stuff in Ireland has started to challenge the delivery of public services, and it's starting to invite a different discussion about what does service delivery look like and what is the spatial context of that. None of that, as I remember it, was really there in 2003.
No, but I completely agree, and I don't think I think in general, when you try to engage with the developers about, well, how might we provide a different typology for the retail, or look at these examples which are outside of Ireland, I think you're met with, well, I'm sorry, but this is how Lidl operate. Well, I'm sorry, but this is how the HSE operate. Well, I'm sorry, but this is, they won't, in Ireland, people won't, those service providers, the way that they fund and finance their developments, they just haven't even considered these things. And it can be quite frustrating. And in Adamstown, the plan allows them to build like that. So you're kind of, you have what you have in many ways, So as you said, I think it's a lesson, and I think there's some really great stuff in there, but there is probably a bit of a growth needed next round. There's some great stuff in there, but there is probably a bit of a growth needed next round.
From Mick, your experience in Adamstown, but also much wider, and Diarmaid for you as well, is there value in having these strategic development zones for some places, but then having a kind of normal, more regular planning system for elsewhere, maybe pepper potting these strategic planning zones?
Development
zones, sorry. Diarmaid, do you want
to? I think there is, and I think it goes back to strategic intention, and I think there's something about being realistic and proportionate about resources. So if everywhere was strategic, nowhere is strategic. So it's a bit of everything. And secondly, if you try to do Adamstown by 20 million planning applications, you'll have officers tied up in all sorts of issues. They'll be all in a board planola. It'll be fights left, right, and centre. So that scale of things just can't be done in a normal process. But I think then I think in strategic bits, you have to be very clear about what are the outcomes for which we are going to use this tool. I think if you really clear, what outcome is it that we're after, that we're going to use that one? And the second one then on normal planning, that I think works in existing settlements and in other places, but there needs to be an improvement agenda around that at all levels to say, how do we improve it? And I'm not meaning get rid of planning, it's how do we use the lessons from all of the development management and all of the development planning stuff so that there's an improvement cycle, a strengthening of the understanding, the mutual understanding of planning and the mutual benefits of it. So outcomes first, choose your tools, invest in improvement.
I think just the one thing I'd add is I think SDZs, where they've been successful in Ireland, is places like Adamstown, where there's a small number of interested landowners. I think where they probably wouldn't work is places like Tala or Nace Road, which are our big brownfield regen lands with multiple landowners in there, I think. And in those places like that, I think what we're doing now is put together a framework, and a lot of the points that Diarmaid talked about earlier about is identifying those early movers and how we can grow a place off that and evolve a plan accordingly. The other thing I'd say, in addition to some of those SDZs being probably too restrictive in some instances, I think the other bit that would be a merit in changing in the future would be when you designate an area, there needs to be a process of clearer government support that runs alongside not just drawing a line and drawing a line around an area. It has to come with a package of investment and a coordinated approach for basically putting money in the ground to build those strategic pieces of kit, which are large reasons why Adamstown, in addition to the recession, it was a large reason why Adamstown was slow out of the tracks, and why we have another SEZ at Clonburris, and why that's very slow is that a lot of the big pieces of kit need government investment. Now, I think Ireland's changing, and there is a big conversation around how government can invest in some of those big regen sites now, but that's only now, and SEZs have been around for 20 years, so it's taken a time to get to that point.
For me, one of the other things on that, Mick, is that with the STZ around the government funding and the infrastructure and the enabling funding, I think it's crucial. It's absolutely the scale of it. But it also invites a discussion about service models. So if this is a strategic location and we want to start to see more collaborative services, more co-production, then a condition of government participation should be to invite service providers like the HSE and others to do the collaboration in the areas, and kind of going, we're making it easy to locate, we're reaching the population. A condition of that should be more collaborative service.
Great, thank you very much. And cycling, we had a webinar yesterday about transport and sustainable transport. And has cycling, are there different levels you're experiencing in Adams or other STZs, perhaps the non-strategic development zones? And I also wonder about the connectivity. So do people cycle to the edge? Is that good? And then how do the cycle routes connect through to places adjacent to it?
Look, I think one of the, and I mentioned this already, is I think when the plan was put in place, 2003, and when that street network was set in place, cycling wasn't on the agenda like it is now, and I think we're retrofitting in some instances better cycling infrastructure into the street network, and you've got a street width of a certain amount, and you're then trying to put a cycle lane into a new street and trying to tackle some of those things. I think cycling infrastructure in Dublin is pretty poor, and we're actually as a council are just developing what we're calling Cycle South Dublin, which is a program of prioritised cycle upgrades across the county, and we're just about to go out to consult on that shortly. But I think, the point that you've made already yourself is the cycle network is getting delivered in Adamstown, but when you get to the edge of it, it's limited. But what we're hoping to do through Cycle South Dublin is to connect our big centres and our big regen areas together, and then connect them through better routes into the city, so people can cycle through those. I think cycle infrastructure in Dublin isn't great. I think COVID has actually provided a really, and I'm sure this is across Ireland and England and the UK, I think COVID has provided a really great opportunity for people to put in temporary measures and to trial things, which we're trying to do, but with sometimes a lot of local opposition.
Yeah, in Diarmaid, in Edinburgh, certainly there were big plans.
That's right, Roisin, and there's been some interesting interventions. So I guess in the full lockdown scenario, it was interesting to see how much people were using cycle paths and cycle as a way of just kind of engaging with the environment and getting out. So that was kind of good. But it came on the back of a transformational city transport strategy, which is very intentional about shifting modes towards active travel. So we've kind of got a big discussion on that, and a very contentious one. Not everyone agrees with it, and it's interesting around legitimacy and liberty. So some people feel that very viscerally, that this is the state intervening and it's taken rights away. So although there's benefits for some, the legitimacy discussion has kind of kicked in, and that comes in then into the pop-up infrastructure, where for some people the pop-up infrastructure has been amazing. It's provided new temporary interventions to provide more opportunities and more access. For other people, the exact same infrastructure has been an affront. So I think what's really interesting around cycling and walking is that although the health benefits are clear, it's the political navigation of that infrastructure into the public realm is the bit. The technical bit, we can stick up we can stick stuff up. I think that the big issue for cycling and walking is political narratives and legitimacy, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, really, really important point. Okay, I think we've come to the end of our questions here, so I'd like to thank you both, Diarmaid and Mick, for fantastic presentations. Really got to the nub of good, sustainable urban and communities, and hopefully we can all see more of those coming forward. I'd like to thank everyone for your questions as well and for attending today. A recording of this session and all the Northern Ireland Planner Live webinars will be available on the RTPI's YouTube channel, so you can tune into those. And I'd also like